Susan Lucille Wright was a beautiful blonde, 21-year-old when she met Jeff Wright, 8 years her senior. It was love at first sight, but neither knew the dark secrets the other held or the twisted road ahead, and it's not what you might think. Susan's life seemed to be on track after a brief stint as an exotic dancer straight out of high school. She used her earnings to pursue nursing but later found the demands of school too much, so she settled into working at a hair salon. Jeff, on the other hand, was coming down from years of wild partying, fueled by alcohol and cocaine. As his 30th birthday approached, he knew he was tired of the party life and wanted a family. When the pair met, he instantly knew Susan was the one. A few months into their relationship, Susan told Jeff she was pregnant. He saw this as the perfect moment to propose. They married in late 1998 in a small Houston ceremony and soon welcomed their son, Bradley, to the outside world. They were living the dream, a beautiful house, and another baby on the way, but Jeff's cocaine habit was a constant source of tension. His drug-fueled rages left Susan bruised and terrified. He would get aggressive with both her and the kids. Susan would be kicked, punched, and slapped repeatedly during his coke-fueled rages. Her repeated pleas for him to get clean fell on deaf ears. On January 13th, 2003, Jeff was on another high. After a heated argument, he allegedly raped Susan and threatened to kill her. Later that evening, he hit Bradley while trying to teach him how to box, leading to yet another fight. What happened next, however, is disputed. So let's break it down. The prosecution story. According to the prosecution, Susan had reached her breaking point. After putting the kids to bed, dressed in only a silk robe, she lured Jeff into their bedroom with promises of romance. Susan began to slowly and seductively tie each of his limbs to the bed's headboard and footboard with a tie from her silk rope, as well as Jeff's silk neckties. But once he was tied to the bed, she unleashed years of pent-up fear and anger. First, she took a candle and, after kissing her husband's chest, poured the wax on his inner thigh. Jeff screamed and struggled to get free, but couldn't. Next, all he could do was watch as Susan pulled out a knife while holding his genitalia in her hand. Jeff suffered 41 stab wounds to his face, 23 to his neck, 46 to his chest, 22 to his abdomen, 7 to his pubic region, including a superficial cut on his penis, 19 to his legs, 23 to his arms and hand, and 1 to his back. The tip of the knife had broken off in his skull, as well as on his thigh. Candle wax was also found on Jeff's scrotum. The over 200 wounds on his body showed the rage that had finally consumed Susan. The prosecution continued, saying that when she saw the blood-stained walls, floor, and furniture, she knew she needed to cover her tracks. After showering, she called Jeff's parents, 150 miles away in Austin, Texas, claiming he'd stormed out after a fight where he'd hit both her and Bradley. Once the call was finished, burying his body was next on her list. Jeff had recently dug a hole in their backyard ready for a fountain they were going to install, which Susan decided was the perfect place to bury his body. She put him on a pulley and wheeled him through the house to the patio, then pushed him into the grave that Jeff had unknowingly dug for himself. After cramming him in, she began scooping handfuls of dirt on top of him. Back inside, she cleaned up the blood, including the path of blood from the bedroom to the patio. She put the bloody sheets into a bag, and along with the bloody mattress, left them at the back of the house. She then loaded the kids into the car, stopped at a hardware store, and picked up some paint to repaint the bedroom. Apart from a huge bleach spot on the carpet, Susan felt everything looked 100% back to normal. She'd even bleached the blood off her clothes. She was in the clear, or so she thought. Jeff's parents had spent a sleepless night waiting for a call or a visit from him, which obviously never happened. The next afternoon, they called Susan and asked if Jeff had ever come home. She told them he'd briefly come home to pack his clothes, and they had ended up in yet another shouting match. Jeff had gotten so angry that he took a bottle of bleach and shook it all over the bedroom and her clothing. I'll give it her. That was some quick thinking, but instead of helping, her story really confused the Wrights, as this didn't sound like the Jeff they knew and loved, and were both now even more desperate to talk to him. Susan, however, had also told them that Jeff had forgotten to take his phone, which is why he hadn't been picking up their calls. Susan then began receiving calls from Jeff's boss and her neighbor. Susan told them both the same story as she'd told her in-laws. Upon hearing the story, her neighbor encouraged Susan to file a report about the abuse with police, in case Jeff came back and attacked her. The more and more people began asking about Jeff's whereabouts, and Susan realized time was running out. It was getting harder to field the barrage of questions while keeping her story straight, and she knew it wouldn't be long before Jeff's parents would simply turn up on her doorstep. So on Wednesday, January 15th, 2003, Susan walked into the Harris County Constable's office and filed a report telling the same story she told everyone else. Officers took pictures of the cuts and bruises on her hands and body to accompany her statement. She told police she was terrified of what Jeff would do if he came home and found out that she'd reported the argument, so they reassured her and a judge granted a restraining order for her and the children. She let the entire charade play out, despite knowing that there was no actual threat to her or the children's lives. By Saturday, Susan was at breaking point. The pressure of everyone calling her with their endless questions was becoming too much to bear. The family had a little chow mix dog that would be the final straw for Susan's frayed nerves. Outside, in the very spot where she'd buried Jeff's body, Susan saw the dog had begun digging at the thin layer of soil she'd spread across his grave. Jeff's arm was poking out, and the back of his head was also showing. That wasn't the worst part. The dog, thinking he'd found a toy, had chewed Jeff's hand off, and it was lying on the patio like some sort of Halloween prop. Susan, they said, was mentally and emotionally done. She grabbed the kids, got into the car, and drove to her mother's house. There she told her about the restraining order, and how terrified she was that Jeff would kill her if he came back. The thing about mothers, though, is that they know their kids inside and out, no matter how old they are, and Susan's mum knew something wasn't right with Susan's tale. Finally, she looked at her daughter and said, "Susan, did you kill Jeff?" Susan nodded and slumped forward onto the tabletop. Susan's mum sent her grandchildren to stay with Susan's sister, Cindy, and then called a criminal defense attorney. Police were called by Susan's lawyer, and when they arrived at the house, she told them where they could find Jeff's body. Although Susan thought she'd thoroughly cleaned the murder scene, when police searched the bedroom, they found plenty of blood, not visible to the naked eye. Her arrest had taken place on January 24th, 2003, but the prosecution was retelling this version at her trial over a year later on February 24th, 2004. The prosecution team urged the jury to see that the tears Susan was crying in court were nothing more than crocodile tears. She was simply money hungry and had not been in fear of her husband. Instead, had killed him in order to collect the $200,000 life insurance policy he had. They argued that she was not a battered woman. This was 100% a case of divorce by homicide. To drive their point home, they brought into the courtroom Jeff and Susan's actual bed, where the prosecution team reenacted the murder for the jury. The district attorney actually straddled the assistant district attorney and pretended to stab him all 193 times, while Susan watched on from the defense table in tears. If it wasn't so serious, it would be comical. I'm honestly surprised the judge allowed it, as theatrics aren't usually allowed in murder trials. To this day, I'm sure everyone in the courtroom has never forgotten that moment. In the defense's story, Susan's defense told a completely different tale. On the stand, Susan claimed that Jeff had attacked her with a knife after she'd given him an ultimatum over his drug use. Angry, he'd thrown her to the ground, where she'd managed to grab the knife, but it had hit her knee, causing her leg to jerk up and hit Jeff in the groin. Then, as she pushed him off her, in self-defense, terrified for both hers and the children's safety, she'd stabbed him in the neck, According to her, Jeff then tried to take back the knife. So she stabbed him in the chest. She went on to tell the court that at one point her son knocked on the door of the bedroom, which caused her to stop stabbing her husband. 3. And instead tied Jeff's arms to the bed while she put her son back in his bed. Heading back into the master bedroom, she continued to stab Jeff, still fearing that, because he wasn't dead, he could still harm her. In the struggle, his head and shoulder had hit the nightstand, and a candle that was on the nightstand fell onto Jeff, which is how he was found with candle wax on his thigh and groin. When the prosecution cross-examined her, they asked her to explain why she'd stabbed him nearly 200 times, to which she replied that once she'd started, she couldn't stop, because she was terrified he would kill her if she did. Her defense team argued to the jury that Susan had suffered a break from reality, thus explaining why she had continued stabbing after putting her son back to bed. In Susan's dazed state, she couldn't tell when he was dead and then was scared he would come back to life. What about all of the things she'd told people over the week? Following the murder again, they said in her delusional state, she'd continue to believe Jeff would come back to life. In fact, they argued the number of stab wounds found on his body proved that exact fear rather than a premeditated, cold-blooded killing. After years of physical and emotional abuse, they said she'd finally decided to fight back. A number of witnesses testified that they saw Susan in the past with a black eye and a bruise on her forehead, and her sister testified that she saw bruises on her body on a number of occasions. She told the court that Jeff would give Susan $75 every week, and she had to ensure that was enough to cover the cost of food and things required for the household. The house also had to be immaculate at all times. If it wasn't, then Jeff would beat her. So whose version would the jury believe? Well, ultimately, the jury sided with the prosecution. After just 5.5 hours of deliberation, Susan was convicted of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. The media dubbed her the Blue-Eyed Butcher. In 2005, a new witness emerged, Misty McMichael, Jeff's ex-fiancée, and the now wife of former NFL Super Bowl champion Steve McMichael, who revealed that she too had suffered abuse at Jeff's hands throughout their 4-year relationship. One time he had thrown her down a flight of stairs, and another had cut her with a broken glass from a bar. She had filed an assault charge but had dropped it out of fear. Based on Misty's testimony, the Court of Appeals in Texas granted Susan a new sentencing hearing. On November 10th, 2010, 5 years was taken off her original sentence, meaning she would be eligible for parole from February 2014 onwards. On June 12th, 2014, Susan applied but was denied parole. Her next attempt on July 24th, 2017 was also unsuccessful. However, her third time was the charm, and in December 2020, Susan was granted parole after having served 17 years for Jeff's murder. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice stated that the terms of her parole meant she needed to undergo anger control training and counseling, secure employment, remain in the state of Texas, and wear a GPS tracking device until 2024. Bradley and Kaylee, her and Jeff's children, were adopted by Jeff's brother Ronald. After Susan's sentencing, they are now young adults on her release. As of today, it appears Susan has kept a low profile, out of the media's eye, with no information available about her current whereabouts, family status, or anything significant about her post-prison life. Was Susan a cold-blooded killer or a victim who finally snapped? What's clear is that Jeff was abusive, and Susan had lived in fear for years. The night she killed Jeff, he had a significant amount of cocaine in his system, which supports the theory that he was a danger to her and the children. The most dangerous time in any abusive relationship is when the victim tries to leave. Perhaps Susan was simply trying to survive. As someone who has endured an abusive marriage myself, I can empathize with Susan. The mental and emotional scars are often worse than the physical ones. So did she deserve prison time? I'll leave that for you to decide.